Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And before I dive into introducing myself and all that jazz, I'm going to start with a few um, items for housekeeping just to keep us all on the same page. So the webinar is going to be recorded today, and that recording will also be posted on the ESEP's website. I am sure that the conversation with these phenomenal women on this panel and what will be shared today, you might want to revisit. So to do that, visit www.eseps.org. Also, in keeping with the intent of a fishbowl format, there won't be audience comments and questions during this session, so it will be a conversation amongst the panelists, and hope that you all kind of take it in and reflect, and welcome to contact us to follow up on any of the insights we've provided today. Also, closed captioning is available for this session. It isn't 100% accurate, but it will get you to where you need to go. So if you click the CC button at the bottom right of your screen, it will activate that feature for you. And also, should any technical difficulties arise for you, you can reach out to the ESEPS team at 209-683-0562 or email them at that email right there that I'm not going to repeat. So thank you so much. So I'll go ahead and get us started. And we won't be using slides today because this is a conversation. Hi, my name is Dr. Ashley Williams, and I am the Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for the Study of Childcare Employment at UC Berkeley, where we focus on research and policy solutions with a particular focus on the ECE workforce. And so happy to be here. And just want to do a little bit of framing before we get the conversation started today. This panel actually came to be from a conversation that happened a few months back when I was bringing up some of the challenges that folks participating in apprenticeships encounter and the connections to broader issues impacting the ECE workforce. And for lack of words, it was interesting enough for Randy to suggest that we engage in a conversation in this format to contribute to the broader discourse about the role of implicit bias and how it influences people's day-to-day experiences. So just to start, because I'm here for shared understanding. So when we talk about implicit bias, I said, well, let's see, what does that mean? So I looked it up in the dictionary, okay? According to Merriam-Webster, implicit bias is a bias or prejudice that is present but not consciously held or recognized. So everyone has bias, but it's the ones that are implicit that we often don't grapple with because they're often not openly discussed. Yet, if we dig really deep, we can start to see some of the ways our own biases influence how we move throughout our lives. For example, if we took a second to think about our three closest friends, so everyone think about your three closest friends, and then think about what we might notice if we explore if they are of the same race, gender, economic standing, or background as us. We make choices on areas we might live in or send our children to school, or even where we dine and shop. And these are these places that come to mind that you automatically avoid, right? And think if we ask ourselves why, right? So there are lots of reasons that might surface that intersect with location, convenience of connection, and things like that. But what we really have to do is call into question the impact of implicit biases. So today we situate the conversation in acknowledging that implicit bias in no way shuts off when we enter our workspace. It influences the way we shape and implement programs and how we design policies, no matter how well-intentioned we are. The impact of these biases fall in the laps of program participants, families, communities, and children. And so this is something critical for us to examine. However, it would be irresponsible of me at this moment to discuss implicit bias without situating it in the broader context of structural, systemic, institutional, and even internalized racism. After this conversation was initially conceptualized, we saw an unprecedented increase in violent attacks on the Asian Pacific Islander community, where anti-Asian sentiments have evolved due to systemic racism. Yet this is not new. This is also at a point in time where anti-racism has necessarily been glaring in the national discourse in response to the historic, consistent dehumanization and devaluation of Black people, Black bodies, and Black life. A reality that is so jarring that when there felt to be a moment to breathe a sigh of relief for a critical step in accountability in the death of George Floyd, Ma'Khia Bryant, a child, died at the hands of police force, right in the background there. So circumstances aside, we see a reality that your skin color invites a penalty in interactions with law enforcement that could result in losing your life when others with similar or identical solutions are afforded to live another day. So this is a real context that many people are grappling with in our daily communities. So our panelists today are all women of color. And when we think about our early childhood educators, families, children, these are mostly people of color in California. And these are also the folks who are most marginalized and minoritized on multiple levels. So today we share from a space of our own truths and experiences to talk about the impact of multiple dimensions of racism on the institutional, structural systems, interpersonal, internalized levels to contribute to the discourse as it relates to our work, because we know that from our direct experience, on the personal and professional level, the harm caused particularly to people of color participating in programs is also influenced by policies as well. And so I'd argue also that centering our stories as women of color and our experiences is one way to start explicitly challenging implicit biases just by the nature of unsurfacing these biases and connecting them to broader issues of systemic racism and oppression. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. We have our frame. I would love for our panelists to go ahead and introduce themselves. Sabrina, I see your smile popping. Can we go ahead and start with you?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ashley, for all that really, really critical framing. Appreciate that. Good morning, everyone. I think Zooms are always funny because you can't really see everyone. So I feel like I'm talking, just having conversations with these three fabulous women, but really excited to be in conversation with you all. I hope that I'm zooming in right now from San Francisco in my living room, and with a warm cup of coffee on a gray day. I hope you all are comfortable sitting somewhere in your homes and doing the same. Intros are always hard because there's so many pieces to put out there, but I'll say, first of all, I'm a first generation in the US. Parents are of Indian descent, and I'm the first woman in my family to go to college and earn a college degree. And so I am following on my, parents and grandparents and all the hard work they have done to get me here. I'm a program officer at the Irvine Foundation. I've been there for over 2 years. A little quick intro about Irvine. We're a statewide funder foundation that focuses on making sure that all low-income Californians can have access economically. And we think about that in a couple different ways. So I focus on 2 initiatives. One is called the Better Careers Initiative. That's all about access to middle-scale, middle-wage jobs for Californians. And within that, I focus on earn and learn, right? So pre-apprenticeship, apprenticeship, both on the program side and policy side. I also focus on our Priority Communities Initiative. That's all around inclusive economic development that leads to access to good quality jobs for local communities. And so within that, I focus on the Salinas area. Prior to Irvine, I've mostly worked at nonprofits with an economic justice lens. So worked on youth financial capability, entrepreneurship for women of color, and worked at a lot of gender inequity issues in India. So that's a little bit about me. I'm also a mom of 2 young kids. And so ECE is really near and dear to my heart. I think that, as I became a parent and had one kid in a small in-home daycare and another in a little small kindergarten, I just think about how vital and critical are all of the women of color who are helping support my family and take care of my kids. And I have so much utmost respect and gratitude, but more than that, we need to change the system so that the wages are quality and their advancement opportunities. And we really understand how critical this workforce is, that has hopefully gotten a new light in the last year and a half, but shouldn't have to take that. So I'll leave it at that. And I'll go on mute so anyone else can just jump in versus pointing at people.
I'm happy to jump in now. Good morning, folks. I'm Alea Rosario. I am here in my home in Sacramento, California. I am a Latinx Filipino woman, daughter of immigrants, come from a descendant of at least 5 generations of women of color activists from kind of rural California, and a lot of my kind of shaping and ideas around kind of voice and activism and what to do for the things I care about come from my farm worker background and my family's farm worker background. I consider myself a creative. What else? I'm a sister. And my work right now is with the California After School Network. So we support the over 4,500 after school or expanded learning programs here in California and all across the state. It's a workforce that mirrors in many ways the ECE workforce, lots of majority people of color, mostly women in sort of the middle and frontline positions. And so there's a lot of similarities in the way that I get to think about how we're caring for the adult caregivers for our school age children. And yeah, and I think a lot about my own experience as a young-ish woman trying to navigate, building a livelihood, doing things that I care about, and advancing justice in the way that I want to see for the world, and navigating the challenges of doing that. So I'm so happy to be here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation with you all this morning, and I will pass it on over to Joya.
Thank you so much, Alea. Hello, everyone. It's so good to see my wonderful colleagues here today and just share with you. I'm Dr. Joya Chabran. I'm coming to you from Oakland, California, where I was born and raised and matriculated through the Oakland Unified School District, UC Berkeley, and been in the field of early care and education for over 25 years, starting as a parent volunteer, teacher assistant, teacher, center-based, campus-based director, and then through the love of mentorship, taught my first adjunct faculty class in child growth and development, child family community. And today I am wearing the hat of an interim dean of math, science, business, applied technology, and career education, in which the teacher education preparation program is within the career education system at Berkeley City College. So a mouthful, but I will say that the love, as my colleagues have expressed, started from those first moments as a parent volunteer and understanding the critical work that we do, struggling to survive within systems as a young mom and matriculating through a barrier-ridden system with not so clear pathways, as we got to hear about a little bit yesterday, but there's a lot of work to do. And I'm excited to be here with all of you today to discuss apprenticeship and what this looks like as a woman of color within systems of oppression and social institutions designed not always for us to get to livable wages and ensuring access to high quality jobs and benefits. And I want to also echo the power of a 2-gen approach. I am the oldest of 4. I am the first to go to college. And I'm also a mom of 4 whose children witness their parents matriculate through the system who are all now in college. And I do believe in the power of breaking the cycle from a 2-gen approach. And I'm very passionate, not angry, as sometimes that shows up through passion. We'll talk about the implicit bias that comes with these particular roles in leadership. So thank you for your time today. And I'm looking forward to this chat.
All right, well, let's get started. So, I figured a way that we can explore this conversation when we look at explicitly challenging implicit bias and the ways in which it's situated in broader, racism and oppression, right? I think it's important for us to start by grounding ourselves in the conversation, right? To look at the personal level, and then from there, we'll kind of take it into a professional context and then lead into the systems context. So that's going to be kind of the flow of our conversation. And so, we all on this panel, we touch the work related to ESEPs and apprenticeships in different ways. But what we all have in common, I believe, I don't know, I've only met you on the internet, so I can't say for sure, I'm just kidding, but we're all human beings, right? We're all human beings. And so it's really important that we start our conversations exploring issues of bias, racism, oppression, and inequity by grounding it in the human experience, humanizing it, right? And so I invite us to start by sharing, what were some of your early experiences of being impacted by bias, racism, and oppression, inequity? And also, let's just start there. What were some of your early experiences being impacted by these things?
I'm happy to start. I think one thing I was thinking about this question is I have just a couple of really vivid images of when we first came to the States when I was really young. We moved around a bit for different jobs, and my dad landed a job in Kansas in the mid 80s. And I think I was in first or second grade, and at that time there weren't many South Asians in Kansas. It was very white where we were living. To the point where, there was a KKK flyer dropped off at our house. And I remember my grandparents, my mom's parents were visiting, and they're both sick. So my grandfather wears a turban, and, my grandmother wears a traditional sari. And my parents thought it would be a great idea that they come to my first grade class to teach the class a little bit about India, the culture, the food, and just share. And I just remember all the kids laughing at my grandparents, and from that day on, somehow calling me monkey, that was my name, and just that initial just feeling of I'm not welcome here, I do not belong. And so that's kind of one of my first memories that came up.
I just remember in growing up, there were spaces of people that did not necessarily look like me, or what my mom believed would be unsafe. She would be quiet. She would always shush us to be quiet, to keep us safe. And, as I remember those experiences, grew up really loved and supported by my family, but there was these instances where it was children, are to be seen, not heard, be quiet. And I never quite got it, but it would always make me nervous when it wasn't comfortable. And I realized in those younger experiences, having a mom growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, and from the South, those were some real instances of our safety that comes from, honestly, the residual impacts of slavery. I mean, we were taught to be safe, and and as I matriculated through the field, I realized we have to unsilence the dialogue and not shush and get into some good trouble, as John Lewis used to say, and matriculating through the field as a young mom and becoming an advocate and heads our policy council, president, all these things that I experienced, I had to learn to unsilence and to speak up and to speak out and love my mom. But I do realize we also, as a teacher, have our own biases as it relates to those who can speak and not speak, who can take risk or not take risk. Certain children who take risks get suspended. So some of the things, I'm not going to go in depth today, but just some of those early messages that you got just because that's who our families were and they wanted to protect us. Actually, as we show up in certain spaces and we're at these tables with people that don't look like us, that's not the time to be silent. We have to voice, especially the current context that we're in today. So some of the ways that it's shaped me along the way.
Yeah, one of the memories that just kept coming up, it wasn't the earliest, but it's one that I think about often is, it's in observing sort of the experiences that my parents had in the workplace, right? And like my dad being mistaken for the janitor at his workplace, or the one that really gets me is, is hearing my mom, who was a stay-at-home mom, didn't go to college, was a parent volunteer, and sort of made her way, into a career in education and youth development. And she was working for the district, the school district that I went to in our small little rural community. And she was at a meeting, trying to advocate on behalf of our communities, and was voicing and using her voice. And she got berated by one of the leaders in publicly, right? And I heard her sort of debriefing over multiple times with my dad, right? And it was scary kind of to hear, right, that like adults did that to one another, that it was so public, that it made my mom fearful of repercussions, but also like, doing what's right. And so Joy, you talked about it a little bit, sort of this like kind of conflict, I guess, of being raised, right, to be, again, descendant of 5 generations of activist women, right? Like we are taught, and I was supported and had models of using your voice and doing what's right, and doing what's right on behalf of the things you care about, and then also seeing the impact of that, right, and the consequences of that. I still think about, right, when I find myself at a table where I'm the only person that looks like me, and what the consequences can be to do what I feel is right.
Thank you to each of you for offering up a piece of yourselves in this conversation for us to kind of really think about how deep these issues run and how they kind of shape, like Alea, you were saying, you think about it, like it really, these experiences don't leave you, especially when they are repeated or continuously communicated to you. And this kind of brings me to my next question about, the stories that we're told about ourselves as people of color, as women of color, and what that means. I am from South Central Los Angeles, and growing up, there were lots of implicit messages about who I was, who I should be, who my family was, and how we were treated and interacted with in that space. And so I think kind of thinking about the stories that were told to us about ourselves and how that upholds this sense of oppression, and how do we grapple with and unlearn that? So can you all think of some examples of when you have been grappling with unlearning some of these biases that might have been told to you about you and your folks, your people, and what that meant for you.
I feel like we're in a rhythm where so I'm just going to keep on with the rhythm unless, okay. Yeah, I think, in South Asian, for South Asians, I think there's this myth of like the model minority, right? So what is that? And it's something that you're taught externally, but also kind of was like, as Joya was saying, like my parents kind of affirmed to like, be quiet, head down, work hard, don't cause any trouble, right? Be submissive as a woman, right? And so I think there's just like a lot of realization that there's a lot of actually privilege in that myth, and also was a lot to dismantle internally, but also when you're thinking about how that myth pits communities of color against each other, and that it makes it so that you're not supporting and uplifting other communities of color. And so it also just made me realize, like, just as Joya, you were saying, right? Like you said so eloquently, it's like about if you stay silent and you don't make any trouble, then you're not making any positive change for the communities that you care about. And so like dismantling that internally and also just externally so that people see you differently.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ellie.
Yeah, sure. Switch it up. Yeah, Sabrina, what you said it resonates a lot. And, as a younger child, like I remember being praised for being quiet, right? And like being praised by school teachers, and the other adults I interacted with for, being kind of studious, right? And kind of getting my stuff done, but also like quiet, right? And so that, that internalization, right, of like then trying to figure out how and when my voice is valued, like that took a lot of of unlearning and unpacking, and and to be honest, that's still happening today. When people say like your voice is so important, or thanks for sharing, and it doesn't seem like you have any fear, like that came from being terrified, right, to say anything as a young child, all the way up until my like mid-20s, right? Like my voice would literally like shake, and I would like repeat things in my head before saying it aloud, to make sure, right, that it was the right thing, or that it was valuable when I wasn't being kind of quiet or silent. And so the ways of unpacking that is kind of telling stories like this, right, and hearing stories of others, and really having like a community or confidants, right, to like talk about that, and encourage one another, and notice, right, when we are sort of breaking the cycle or unlearning something in one another. And like the funny story of my unlearning is like, I probably as like a teenager, right, I started to recognize like, I'm not going to be a subservient woman, right? Like, I'm not going to just be a quiet woman. And like the manifestation of that as like a teenager was like, I'm going to reject doing any domestic work, right? And so it's like, I'm not going to cook, right? Like, I don't want to do that. I'm not going to be, confined to these domestic roles. And, it's sort of a funny thing now, but that was sort of my like, way of rejecting the biases and the stories that were put on me. And now as a later older adult, right, I'm kind of like unpacking that and having to learn how to cook and and take care of everything that I need to take care of, and also like really recognize what are there any lingering ideas that I have about domestic work, right? And am I kind of ensuring that I'm recognizing and actively kind of promoting, right, this culture in our society where domestic work is devalued, right? But it's also very much pushed on a certain population. And so again, it's sort of this ongoing, continuous unlearning that happens. And I don't like to do the dishes, but I do it. I don't like to cook. I get very stressed out now, but I do it. Yeah, that's what comes up.
I just have to laugh because I think you and I would have been best friends as teachers because I'm smiling and nodding with all of that. So thank you.
I love it. And I just want to just add, just being around incredible women like you and having, you know, role models, like when Vice President Kamala Harris said, "Excuse me, Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking." So having examples like that to really bring to life how you can show up and show out professionally without losing your job because you are passionate about something that matters. And then you begin to really unlearn and think about, for example, well, what is language development? What does that look like for our children of color? And why are our children of color silenced in certain ways? Because the first thing we do when we hold a baby is we're trying to keep them quiet, not recognizing that there are that child is speaking to you and they're communicating to you, and why are you shushing them, and where does that come from, and how is that deeply rooted? So when you really begin to reflect on the things that matter and you begin to challenge implicit bias explicitly, because like you, Alea, I don't like to cook either, but I got 4 children and somebody has to feed them, but my husband and I, we take turns, and so you begin to think about what matters and why we do what we do, and challenge the things. Like I love my mom, and as we matriculate through life together, she began to learn. I was her first. And so she said, you know, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize, you know, these things. And now we're able to, you know, I'm the oldest, as I share, and I have nieces and nephews, and I say, don't shush him. He is telling you something. And so I'm just saying, just those little things begin to explicitly challenge why we do what we do it. And hopefully the examples and models that we get to experience today and these credible women I get to have a conversation with this morning shapes us. And we have to continue learning. It doesn't matter, like I have a doctorate, but I still got to learn. It's lifelong. And so as long as I continue to engage in that way and have people around me that checks me, and I'm a checker, you're going to hang with me, I'm going to challenge you. So that's what comes out for me in this conversation as we think about how we show up today. And I'm going to pass it back to our wonderful moderator.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Joya. And as you all were discussing, I was kind of writing down a few threads to kind of help transition into the professional context. And it made me reflect on an experience that I had, you know. So I shared I'm from South Central Los Angeles, and I went to Crenshaw High. Might have heard of it. Love and basketball is a thing. But you know, I remember being in at the time when I was in my senior year. It was when they were kind of piloting a new standardized testing system for the state, right? So it was in pilot phase, but what would happen after, like the next years after, it would kind of determine whether students were graduating or not, right? It was kind of like a factor. So it was a huge deal. And I just remember just the atmosphere at that time and being so silenced and policed in the ways in which we moved through school because we were preparing for the standardized tests, right? And I remember getting the test and reading through one of the questions. Context is everything, right? And I believe it was in the math section, and it said something, I can't remember exactly what it was, but there was a word there that I did not recognize, right? So I raised my hand and I asked the teacher, like, oh, like, I don't recognize, like, what is this word? And she's like, I'm sorry, like, I can't help you, which one, I was crushed because this was my favorite teacher, like my English teacher, and like who introduced me to, you know, my creative writing side, right? So I was just that dynamic of like, I can't help you. That just was an odd dynamic, but the word that I was struggling with was spelled BISTRO. So I was like, it's always stuck with me because I was just like, what is a bistro? Like I've never heard of this. Like, what is it? So after the test, I remember like asking friends and they're like, I don't know, I saw that too. And I have no idea. And so when you think about kind of that, the context, like I was in South Central, there were no bistro, like that's not even, it wasn't part of our dialogue and language, right? But what that told me was there were no, it didn't acknowledge the cultural context in which we existed in which we were learning in which we were living in, right? Yet we were kind of being judged, rated, monitored, assessed on something that had nothing to do with us, right? And that always stuck with me. And it really made me feel, because of course I didn't perform well on that standardized test because a lot of the questions were situated in these contexts that kind of uplift a life experience that was not parallel to mine at all. And so I bring that up to say, once I moved to San Francisco to go to San Francisco State, I was working in Jumpstart. And that's a preschool program where you work with young children to develop their literacy skills. And I love it. This was actually my introduction to ECE because I did not want to be a teacher, as many teachers say, right? But I remember part of being in Jumpstart, you had to kind of administer these assessments to the preschoolers. And I was working with this little girl, and it was an assessment that showed 4 pictures, right? So they were like a square and had 4 little pictures. So it was just like snake, dog, ball, van, right? And so the question was like, okay, for lack of words, let's say angel. And so I said, okay, Angel, can you tell me, point to the picture that starts with the word that starts with the letter D. So she pointed to dog and snake, right? And so I didn't have any formal training at the time, but they didn't give me any rules. So I said, that's interesting. Why did she pick snake? Like, like, why did she pick 2? And so I said, oh, Angel, can you tell me why you said dog and snake? And she was just like, yeah. And I was just like, well, they start with D? And she was like, yes, dog and the snake. And I said, you know what? Actually, there was a cultural capital that was relevant to her and her lingo. And I was just like, this was an actual thing that when I thought about I went to my professor at the time because I said, how do I rate this? Like, what is this? And it really started to unpack the ways in which, you know, the capital we have in our communities and how we are silenced and how what we bring into spaces and academic spaces and professional spaces a lot of times are either facilitated to be erased or put to the wayside, and we have to kind of shift and change ourselves to exist in that space. And so when I reflect on that story, knowing that Angel was 4 years old, that brings a sense of pain for me, right? Because I'm just like, wow, what is this assessment communicating, right? Because then I'm going to her family and saying, oh, like she said it was this snake and it wasn't. And then they're kind of doing what you're saying, Joya, is like, oh, then the family goes, oh no, it's not snake, or this is not right, and how that kind of shrinks the potential of children. And so I can see like different threads of how that kind of just can flow throughout our professional work, especially as we think about apprenticeships and folks learning skills and developing skills to work with younger children. But I just wanted to share that to kind of bring us to now centering in on the professional context. Right. And so I think we can acknowledge that the professional context, especially when we exist in institutions of higher education, it's built on a hegemonic framework that uplifts whiteness as a standard of success or dictates a hierarchy that deems whiteness to be or being adjacent to whiteness as superior, right? And so these are kind of constructs that exist in the ways that we go about the work. So, you know, these ideologies of, you know, hegemony, white supremacy, you know, kind of undermining cultural capital of people of color permeates our institutions and our work in so many ways. And I'm not necessarily saying our specific workplaces, but this is work in education and it's here. So can you talk a little bit about how you navigate, and Julia kind of brought up good trouble, but how do you navigate in your workspace, whether that be for yourself, the students you work with, families, you know, however that works, how do you navigate kind of unsilencing the dialogue, right? To kind of raise these issues of, you know, bias, oppression, racism, all of those things, and kind of get into good trouble. So how do you navigate that?
Ashley, I'm just going to start really quickly with just the example that you shared just now. I mean, you had to have an ethical care about that child to do well, and you had to scaffold and be intentional with understanding her perspective and the importance of cultural congruent pedagogy, having the relationship with the child so that they can feel safe, and taking that assessment and understanding that mistakes are not gotcha. We learn from them. And so I say that as a premise to being in the community college setting, very intentional in thinking about the faculty who are training our teachers, the tutors that we have embedded in our courses that ensure that they're reflective of them linguistically and just have an ethics of care. And that's important. You have to start from there. You stated I wasn't formally trained, but you were caring enough to figure it out. And, you know, I hate to go here, but before the Brown versus Board of Education, we had a lot of teachers that looked like children. And then after that act, we had a lot of teachers that looked like the children that lost their jobs. And so we have to really think about the intentionality of who we're hiring, who is in the classroom, how are we reflecting? Does our leadership look like those who are caring for the children, you know, working with the children? So just all of those things you have to unlearn, challenge, think about your HR practices, think about what are the policies and decisions in place as it relates to even your shared governance. Are the shared governance people who are making the votes about the job reflective of who you're? So all of these things, I know I brought up a lot in a really quick amount of time, but I just want to appreciate you for that story, because I was that tester that did not test well. And it took a really powerful, you know, person who knew me, my counselor. I went to Skyline High School, for any of the Titans out there who, for whatever reason, the school I transferred in said, you know, you're in the wrong classes. You're never going to get to college if you don't get into these classes. My parents didn't know, I didn't know, but because of that counselor, I was able to go to UC Berkeley and graduate and matriculate on and go and get my doctorate. But I share that to say that it really takes a person in a child's life that ethically cares about them. And I appreciate the care economy and all the funding that's coming in. That it matters to get our economy back to work, but we really got to think about early care and education, the early learning part. Childcare is important, but there is this intentionality with teaching that we really have to explicitly make clear to all, so that all of the things that we've been talking about in this conference addresses these systemic oppression wages, and I'll just leave it at that. But thank you. I don't know who wants to kick in after that.
Yeah. Well, I have two things coming to mind. I'll start with the easier one, because it's sort of a parallel example of, you know, in my work, I spent a lot of years facilitating a leadership development program for people of color in the kind of out of school time youth development fields. And then, you know, continuing on in my work now, we are kind of engaging, you know, stakeholders and networks and committees. And in each of these instances, we have applications, right? To either join the program, join the committee, or so on. And one of the things that has to be very intentional in our like design, right, is how we are assessing the quality of these applications. And right, and the characteristics of white supremacy have to be known, right, for us to like do the antidote. So like this worship of the written word, right? Perfectionism, like all of those things I had to learn. And then I had to make sure our other assessors, right, also weren't evaluating the quality of someone's responses because they were long, right? But if someone, and especially if we're trying to engage people of color, right, and like recognize their as you brought up, Ashley, like cultural capitalism, different ways of communicating, right? Like that spelling was not going to be like a demarker, right? Like we weren't going to reject someone because they misspelled something or because they wrote like a conversation, right? And so like that, and there was pushback, of course, on that, right? Like and that's where we had to engage both like assessing the like written application piece, and then we made sure there was dialogue, right, to like unpack what the like numerical scoring was, and how we kind of use other ways of of assessing folks' kind of readiness or what they could bring or so on. And I think that's a tough one, right, to think about now, like as we're working with, with older students or even adults in the workplace. And then, the other thing it's exhausting. It's just like the first response to the question that you asked, Ashley, right? Like how we navigate that. It's exhausting. And especially over the last year, to witness organizations perform allyship and perform equity. It's really tough and extremely draining to, on the daily, right, have to make a determination of, do I name something that's that where our words aren't aligning with our actions, or not, because I'm just too fucking tired, right? Or it won't go anywhere. And so, I think that there needs to be real commitment and follow through for what almost every organization, right, has put out, especially in the last year. And to know that where is the burden falling on, and to whom, right, the burden is falling upon, as organizations kind of listen and learn, right, and like figure things out, because these issues aren't new, right? Like women of color having expressed a much more difficult time, right, navigating their salary increases across the nonprofit world nationally. That is not a new issue in the last year, right? And so if people are calling for that, there needs to be action. And I guess, I'm not talking specifics because I'm trying to like, be mindful of, of what my words might mean. But that comes up, right? It is extremely exhausting. Women of color are going to come with an understanding of the intersections of oppression. That's one of the reasons why women of color need to be in leadership positions, especially in our fields that we're working with. And know that like representation isn't always it, right? Like there needs to really truly be valuing of women of color, people, all of those things, and what they have to say and what they're bringing. And then on the flip side, like, let's be real, there are brown and Black agents of white supremacy in leadership positions. And so again, for the people who kind of have for all of us on the call, right, where we're analyzing and like we have this analysis and we're recognizing, where there are gaps in words and actions in our workplaces. It's really, really exhausting to constantly be the one, right, to bring that up. And so I guess, it's noticing, right, like who else is saying something, who else is experiencing negative impacts of white supremacy in the workplace, and what voices do we really need to be listening to? And it's often going to be the voices that are on the margins that are going to be telling us right what we need to hear.
Thank you both. I'm just, as you can tell, there's a lot of just smiling and nodding going on in this box. I agree with everything you have said. I come from a different space, right? Philanthropy, which we all know has its own issues. Like, let's be very real as a field. We have a lot of issues when it comes to like how we fund and, in these boxes and what we're going to fund. Not if we don't call out like the real reality and dismantle how messed up power dynamics are between the funder and the grantees and try to eliminate those. As the nonprofits that you all lead, or the community colleges, are the ones leading the work on the ground and actually bringing the change, and how do you support that? We also know, like as you were both saying, like communities of color and leaders, especially women of color, they're getting the least resources, and that needs to change, right? We know that. So how do we change that? And also change when it comes to the type of funding we're providing. So it's really flexible, it's multi-year, and you're setting up, these leaders who know the work and how to do it already well to actually just do the work that they're already doing. And I think also you mentioned something really well about just words are great. We all love words, but what's the action and the accountability? And I think as a field, philanthropy has really failed when it comes to being more explicit and accountable to ourselves and to the field and to our grantees around what we're doing well, where we're falling short, and how we're going to change it, and showing like actual metrics for that and communicate it in a very ongoing manner. I think that nothing's going to change if we don't dig into that and look inward as a field.
Absolutely. Thank you all for that just collection of, there were so many gems in everything that was just said across. It's yes, yes, and yes is kind of what I have to say without kind of reiterating the same thing. And I think that, as we kind of discuss, the presence of white supremacy, of understanding intersecting oppression, and the role of women of color leaders, and also kind of how, people of color can also still uphold white supremacist ideologies that are in turn still harmful to our own communities. Those are so important for us to really start to unpack and think through, because, it really has an impact of, facilitating the invisibilization, tokenism, and sensationalism that people of color experience. So I think everything that was covered there is, we could talk about this for months. Actually, and longer than that, because I think, Alea, you were saying like these issues aren't new. Joya, you brought up Brown versus Board of Education. We also heard in the mix of this conversation the enslavement of Black bodies, right? So these are not new issues. They have these constant threads that are rooted in systemic and structural racism that have just permeated our systems and just have such a deep impact and harm for children of color, families of color, educators of color, that we really have to think through. So just thank you all for that. And so now as we kind of think about the system, right, on the systems level, and I'll kind of share this anecdote from my own personal journey in ECE. So I started out in Jumpstart you know, with Angel, right? That story, and bringing that up to my professor and kind of having the opportunity to have that observation affirmed. And I said, ooh, like more teachers need to kind of come, like you said, Joya, from like space of ethical care. And what does that mean? And how can I do that? Because ECE is so critical. These are our babies. These are our youngest learners. And so I said, I want to be a preschool teacher, right? And along that journey, being a preschool teacher, going to college full time as well, and not having the financial, you know, my family couldn't fill in those financial gaps, especially me living in San Francisco. It became clear to me that my earnings as an early educator were not going to cut it, right? So I was actually in school full time, being a preschool teacher full time, and I had another job in retail, and I would take notes on campus to kind of fill in those financial gaps just to make ends meet, right? And so within that, you know, within that journey, it was so isolating. And I thought something was wrong with me because it took me 8 years to get my bachelor's degree, right? And I thought it was because, you know, I was from South Central, you know, I didn't do well on the standardized test. Like I went to college, and like, even though none of my professors look like me, and they're marking up my papers and you know, telling me I'm nice, but like no one's commenting on my intellect and the power of my intellect. So there are lots of things going on. And so, you know, that really led to me kind of making a shift in my career at some point, because compounded by the low wages I was receiving, the working conditions that were just difficult, because you see, you're showing up to work each day, you're working so hard, and you're seeing these broader kind of issues. Like I didn't have the language at the time. I was seeing like these issues that were impacting families and children, and they were coming into the classroom, and my preparation was so fragmented and disconnected that I didn't know what to do except but to leave, to be honest. And so I left the classroom. I left direct service for children and families, because at some point I realized that this is not going to make the impact that these issues that I'm seeing, I didn't know how to name it. And so I went over into teacher education and at San Francisco State. So I had the opportunity to actually work with future educators and workforce members, right? So like, you know, students straight out of high school interested in child development and engaging them in a form of apprenticeship, right? And in that, in seeing my experience being repeated for these same students, it was problematic for me. And I felt guilty, because I was preparing you and being a professor and a Black woman with impeccable style, just you know, in front of you, and like knowing what's meeting you on the other end, and also educating or teaching from frameworks that I didn't even see myself in, right? So, you know, we're going over grand and modern theorists and, you know, Vygotsky and Piaget and all of these things that are forming our work. But, you know, when my students are coming to me with issues that were happening in real time in their communities, when harm was happening in the socio-political context, I had no resources or materials for them at that time, right? And so I started to realize that this wasn't going to be it either. And I turned to policy, and it really helped to illuminate for me and actually heal for me in my journey that, wow, like these are actually systemic issues. These are policy failures. This is willful ignorance to ensure that early educators have a living wage, to ensure that they have the preparation and working conditions they need to do their jobs effectively. And so it actually was a space of healing for me, because all of that time, and I've been in ECE almost 20 years now, I thought it was me. I was like, it took me 8 years and I'm teaching stuff. I don't see myself. My students are going through college and still broke. I'm broke. Like, what does this mean? And so when we think about the systemic, you know, spectrum, which ways do you kind of notice bias, racism, oppression, inequity baked into policies and programs even when we have well-intentioned folks, because I was also one of those well-intentioned folks, and I was just like, oh no. And I started to unpack that and realize the harm. But what ways do you have you noticed these being baked into policies and programs?
I'm going to get off mute to say, Sabrina, you had a really great example. So one of the things I'm thinking about, or that comes up for me, and I said this, as I introed myself, is I am going to think like an organizer at every level. And so when I think about, right, the issues at the systemic level that exist, my thinking goes to the antidote to that is people power, right? And so, right, the length of time it took for childcare to the right to unionize in California, right, is an example of racism, sexism, all of the isms baked into the system, right? And I hope that is I don't know, not a solution, but a way that that can advance solutions and advance improvement for the field and for the workers. When I think about some of the work that I'm doing for the youth worker workforce, is trying to kind of expand access to pathways to becoming a teacher, right? Because we have all of these young adults, young people of color, a lot of women going to work with young people in an after school program who want to become a teacher. And at some point, the journey that you were able to navigate, Ashley, some people are not able to do that, right? They're not able to figure out how to work, go to school, student teach, have another job. A lot of millennial women now are not only caring for, their own children, but they're caring for their parents or grandparents. Millennial women are more likely than the previous generation to live under the poverty line. And so when we think about, right, like the current pathways and the current barriers that exist for some of the youth worker workforce to earn a livable wage, to set themselves onto a career into teaching, those are some of the barriers that we're trying to address. One of them is through an apprenticeship program. So we're hoping to learn a lot from ECE and the apprenticeships that exist now, to leverage at a system level multiple funding streams, right, between the funding streams that exist for after school and expanded learning, apprenticeship funding, teacher and educator preparation funding, right, to build these supportive, right, like we want to wrap our arms around these people to be successful, not just get through the pathway, but to be successful, to love what they do, to have a sense of identity and community for the people they're working with, and the communities they're working in. And we'll see what if the system is ready, right, for us to sort of, it's not even blowing up, right? It's not even that like revolutionary, right? We're just trying to use these existing public dollars to create these pathways. And so we'll see if, if policymakers that are talking about diversifying the teacher workforce, if they're willing, right, to get behind some policies in place that expand access to existing teacher preparation dollars, or if we'll run up against some ways of thinking that there shouldn't be access granted to more people to become teachers. And so that, again, that's sort of the way I think about it, like sort of what does organizing amongst the youth worker workforce look like? There are 30,000 plus youth workers across the state. And we know that they have been the ones on school campuses in person over the last year, working with families, and they don't have the same protections, right, as teachers. And these are young adults. They're not like, I've heard, right, that they're not taught that they have rights as workers, right, to say, I'm not getting PPE, right, or like they're scared to ask or demand from their employer the PPE. And so again, when I think about like this workforce and the opportunity to challenge any barrier that comes up against the system, yes, it's policymakers, yes, it's people like you, Ashley, and me at, working at the system level. And it's also like, really, it's about people power, right? And like how can we mobilize sort of the masses, right, and the people on the ground to push for and tell us what the solutions need to be. So that's what I'm thinking a lot about. We don't have quite the that's not quite happening, but I think that's something that we have the opportunity to do and learn from with ECE. Yeah. And then Sabrina, you could make sure that work is being funded.
Yeah,
right?
I'm working on that. Appreciate it. No, I'm again smiling and nodding to everything you're saying the whole morning. Yeah, I think the people power part is so critical, because it's not, the workforce training and all of that is, yes, also critical, but without that people power, it's really hard to bring the policy changes that are needed. I think I just was thinking about like the apprenticeship world in general, right? And how there needs to be policy changes, how there's even this question of like, who owns apprenticeship at the state level versus like the federal level? How do you make this system easier to navigate to actually get a registered apprenticeship? Like, what does that look like? How do you even get access to knowing that these options are available? And there's actually funding, but it's like, you need to figure out how to braid the different funding sources together. Like, it needs to be much easier to navigate, so you can have more of these types of programs. I mean, I think, I don't know the most recent statistic, but only I think 7% of registered apprenticeship in California of those apprentices are women. 7%, like that's not okay. So we need to change the policies and the systems so that there are more women and women of color in these apprenticeship pathways that get access to like these, pathways, and also the livable wages that we're talking about. So I'm just, again, agreeing and nodding to everything. And then of course, like, yeah, there needs to be more funding from philanthropy. I think, it's interesting, like apprenticeship has been around for a long time and people still don't even understand what it is. So in addition to funding, like education to funders, around like, this is why this is important. This is why we need to be funding more of this and helping fund on the direct services side, but also the policy side, so that those policy recommendations actually become actionable on the ground.
And at time, well stated, ladies. I echo that. I mean, it makes no sense that we're still doing pilots when we know these things work. It needs to be real systemic funding, not these soft dollars, but we need to be able to fund what's working. Just challenge our data-driven results, like our data sets. Like you said, there's 7% of women in apprenticeship. What is wrong with that picture? I love that ECE is now at the table, and I believe now that we need to have the same wages and benefits as our education counterparts, not just K-12, but community college and CTE too. We need to all be on the system that values the work that we do and pays us accordingly. Because I too would love to continue teaching. I started at $5.75 an hour, minimum wage. I loved it, but I can't stay in that as a mom of 4 children in California. So we gotta make sure these policies reflect not just livable wages, but wages that allow us to go there, pay. I'm thinking about the IRS and taxes right now. Like, that's one skill we need to incorporate in our training as we do matriculate up the ladder. But with that, Ashley, I'm just so honored to spend this time with you all today, and just realize that we need to challenge our biases as it relates to even our decisions and the data sets that we're using to even think about these policy changes. Those hard to reach populations are not that hard. Stop with the assumptions, reach them, and let's ensure that their voices, the qualitative data, is included as well as we begin to think about our policy and our systems in place.
Yes, thank you, Joy. And I think that brings us now to kind of our closing, where we, if we could say one thing, and this is going to be like the elevator pitch, right? To decision makers, policy folks, funders, what would it be? And I think I'll kind of start drawing off of what was said there and going with, we're talking about implicit bias, and acknowledging that in ECE decision making, there actually is an existing bias in which we actually do not center the ECE workforce. When we're focused on children and families, which is absolutely important, we have to understand that that intersection with educators is right there and they're part of these communities. And my message is that we will never, ever, ever have an equitable system for children and families if educators continue to experience inequities, period.
From my lens, I think I would just say philanthropy needs to continue to do the multi-year general operating support to women of color leaders who are already kicking butt doing this work on the ground to get out of their way, and just give them the funding.
Yeah, second each of those, and I would say, as policymakers, people that are making decisions, to look around to who you are listening to, and if it's not not people who can represent the workforce, as you said, and center the workforce, as you said, Ashley, if it's not women of color leaders who are doing the work on the ground, like, you need to do something about it, right? And ask the question. And it's not for lack of people, right, who are doing this work. And so ask the questions, reach out to us to ensure that you are listening to and being advised by, right, people that can expand our lenses.
Yeah. Echo everything you all said. I mean, from the community college institution, a 100-year-old organization, it's time to do some changes. And the restricted funds, we need more flexible funding, and we need it systemically in all of our areas that serve children and families. We need to really think about who's at the table, who we're listening to, the data sets we're using to make these policy decisions, and ensure that, like we said, many of our children are situated in family childcare nonprofits. The money. We need to know more soft dollars. It's time to systemically institutionalize what we know is best in our state and whoever state is on this call.
Yes, and I'm getting the message from our tech folks that we should be coming to a close, but I think another message, I know Randy is listening out there. It sounds like there is a part 2 of this conversation that we can pick up on. And just thank you everyone for tuning in and joining us. And we didn't set out to necessarily answer any questions today. It was really about adding to the discourse, contributing to the discourse. And so let's continue to build. So all of our information is available on the conference platform should you have any questions and want to follow up with us. And thank you again, everyone. Be safe, be well, and we'll see you next time.